Welcome to the C-Suite series presented by channelchek and Noble Capital Markets. Noble's an SEC-registered, FINRA-licensed broker-dealer and the source of the equity research available on channelchek. Today's interview features Bodax Bio, Nasdaq ticker symbol BXRX. Noble Senior Research Analyst Gregory Aurand interviews Baudax Bio President and CEO Gerri Henwood. Visit channelchek.com or click the link in the description to access equity research, news, and advanced market data on Bodax Bio, all at no cost. And now, here's Gregory and Gerri.
Hi, this is Gregory and Senior Research Analyst at Noble Capital Markets. And today we're speaking with Baudax Bio. Bodax Bio is focused on developing pharmaceutical products in the acute care setting. We're visiting with Gerri Henwood, President and CEO of Bodax Bio. Good day, Gerri, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Troy. Glad to be here.
For those unfamiliar with Bodax Bio, can you tell us a little bit about your background? Because you have quite an extensive pharmaceutical background. Can you tell us about your background, how it relates to the genesis of Bodax Bio? And then beyond that, tell us what the company actually does and its key products.
Sure. So I started off in the sort of public market side inadvertently after a long career with SmithKline and French, about just under 14 years. I started a contract research organization that back in the day was one of the early ones. Great people and good timing got us to be a public company, led us to develop about 60 products and get approval for various small and large pharma companies. And then we were bought by a much larger New York Stock Exchange listed company. And after the transition period from that, I started up another pharma company called Auxilium Pharmaceuticals. Auxilium was focused on men's health and conditions of aging, and we developed and self-marketed Testim, product that ultimately had sales over 300 million, and Xiaflex, which was not marketed by the time I left the company, but we had filed the BLA for it. It's a product that gets used to treat hyperactive scarring issues like Dupuytren's disease, Peyronie's, and some others. And having left the company because the board was looking for somebody with more biologics experience as Xiaflex launch was coming up, I started an incubator company, and we were helping other young companies to bring their assets along with a pretty experienced team of people that had been crazy enough to work with me through one or more companies prior to that. And out of that grew Recro Pharma, which ultimately brought in both a manufacturing plant in Georgia, and a product, meloxicam, which went on to become Anjeso, which is the first commercial product of Baudax. And about 2.5 years ago, the manufacturing side of the business and the product side of the business split because there were differences in what investors were interested in one or the other platform, and that seemed like a way to unlock some shareholder value. So Baudax split out of Recro with the IV meloxicam product and also some neuromuscular blocking agents, which would be used in anesthesia to paralyze people so that you could put a breathing tube in them, and an agent that could reverse them when surgery was done. They're still in clinical development, but moving along nicely. And the Anjeso product got FDA approval right as the pandemic was beginning in the US, so not ideal timing, but we have been able to plow through it and get formulary approvals at a number of institutions, get usage, and get use of this non-opioid pain product. So it's a little IV push, 1 milliliter, just a little tiny thing. You do an IV push of it into the patient, and it lasts for 24 hours. It takes a little while to get to its peak effect, like about an hour, a little bit more than that. Onset begins at 10 minutes. So many surgeons use this or have the anesthesiologist give it as surgery's beginning, so that it's really fully on board by the time the other anesthesia that they're using during surgery is done. And the product itself, we find to be, very good at living up to its advertisement. That's what surgeons tell us. I called the patient because I hadn't heard from them, and I often will get complaints from patients because the pain relief isn't perfect. And that's not happening. So I called the patient, and the patient said to me, I'm feeling okay. I have some pain, but it's pretty well managed. I don't feel that it's out of control. And that's a real plus for surgeons who don't love just getting home from work and then they're peppered with phone calls for the next several hours, or getting calls from their physician's assistant or nurse practitioner on it. So that's what we try to do. We believe in combination with other non-opioid agents, really helpful in reducing opioid requirements for patients. Some cases totally eliminating them, and many other cases reducing them. And that lets a patient have a little bit quicker recovery time because they're able to be a little more alert. They're able to walk around more. That keeps their body moving. And if they've orthopedic surgery, often the surgeons want them to get moving early. If you have abdominal or intra-abdominal surgeries, again, the more you can start moving and shuffling off to the bathroom, the more your bowels and other parts of your system are going to work more normally. And so that's the goal of the treatment, to relieve your pain and inflammation, and through that to help you to get moving easier, earlier, less recovery time. And in most cases, we're saving the hospital or the ambulatory surgical center costs that might have been associated with a slower recovery or use of opioids that might have had side effects.
Excellent. Well, in addition to facing a COVID pandemic, we've been facing a somewhat overlooked opioid epidemic, and I think that's great that Anjeso kind of fits that perspective very nicely in attacking that particular problem. Investors, though, are interested really in how commercial activities are progressing, certainly with Ingeso, particularly in this environment. And are you seeing formulary meetings progressing nicely despite COVID? And has your strategy shifted at all because of COVID?
Oh, good question. So we'll start with formulary. So if we think of most institutions having as the kind of keeper of the formulary is the director of pharmacy in that institution. They may not be the head of it, but they're often the organizer and the planner of meetings. And certainly during 2020, it was all hands on deck to manage the flood of patients. We hadn't been used to such an event happening before. Systems were stressed. They were out of drug supplies. There was no way they were having meetings to talk about theoretically putting some other drug on formulary. So we saw very few formulary meetings occur during 2020. In 2021, as we got out of the early part of the first quarter, that began to come back. And we did see some formularies meet. And as we had learned from the folks at a company called Cadence, which ultimately got bought by Mallinckrodt, they had a somewhat similar product, not as potent in terms of its ability to relieve pain, but it was a company called Cadence that had Ofirmev, and Ofirmev was an IV version of the drug we call Tylenol, acetaminophen. And it was new. It was the pioneer on the non-opioid side, some now almost 10 years ago. And they often required 2 or 3 cycles on the formulary before they got approval. We haven't seen it quite that bad, but I would say probably half of the formularies that we're applying to, we get tabled and require another meeting. They want to see some more health economic data, even though we had made that available to members of the committee before, but often, maybe they hadn't studied it enough and they weren't ready to respond to precise questions. We can't go to those formulary committees, obviously, but we try to make sure that there are enough people at the institution who know the product, who've had some experience using it, whether there or in an ambulatory care setting, a same-day surgery setting, before they got to the hospital formulary committee. And so that reads right on our strategy. And part of our strategy here has been to try to give you an opportunity to use the product before you have to talk about it to your peers. And the best way to do that is in a smaller setting. Often, even though they're the larger ambulatory care settings, they're not doing as many surgeries in a day and as many ORs as would be in a large hospital. So that has given us an opportunity to get orthopedic physicians or general surgeons doing laparoscopic surgery or bowel surgery to try the product in a setting that isn't in the hospital. And we've made it pretty easy because you can buy in singles, even if you want to just try it on a couple of patients and see if it lives up to its promise. Get enough of those folks, whereas in the old days, maybe there was one or two economically important surgeons to a hospital who could influence getting it on formulary. But, they've really been crushed by COVID. If you can't do elective surgery, it's very hard to meet your bills in a hospital setting. Mostly their medical patients are a little below or just at break even. And so the surgery patients give them more of the funding they need to really keep running well. And they don't have that. They haven't had that at a normal level, certainly in 20 and much of 21. And of course, we started off 22, not so terrifically on that, but what we are finding is that hospitals, surgeons, formularies, and even our own people are finding ways to adapt. It's not quite as straight a shot as it might have been if we didn't have COVID in the picture, but we saw in the second half of 21 things get more robust with like temporary interruptions. So things were going really well May and June. July and August, our southern states, and where we had a fair amount of business, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Southern California, possibly because they are indoors because of air conditioning needs, we saw a big flare. There was, quite a rise and shutdown in facilities for a month or two. Then things came back really looking good, September, October, the better part of November. And then, of course, Omicron reared its ugly head in December and January. But in spite of that, we now, by the end of last year, had 200 formularies that had approved us and where we were on board. And we were getting deepening usage at the institutions where we had gotten on. As you may know, Greg, once you get onto formulary, that's step one. That's not like you're in. You still have to get into the automatic drop-down menus that come on the computer systems that get used to put patients' orders on their chart. Like, you should now get this regimen that includes Anjeso at this time and that kind of thing. And that will often take a further 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks after you're on formulary till that has been implemented and it can be then really easily ordered. And we've seen that once we get on, we do generally get a deepening of those orders and doing really well in a number of places, some of which then got interrupted again in either December or January, because we saw more of the southern states in California a little bit more in January than we did in December. It was like Northeast and Mid-Atlantic that got hit hard.
You touched on elective procedures, and we know there's been some impact. A lot of companies experienced it over the last year or two, particularly healthcare companies, device companies, pharmaceutical companies. Are you seeing procedures, though, at least in the present environment, and you sort of mentioned this, relatively speaking, are they showing up better at hospitals or at ambulatory surgery centers, or is it kind of equal? Because I know at one time hospitals were sort of the leading market, but they kind of fell back last year, if I'm not mistaken. Is it still a 50-50 game, or are the ambulatory surgeries taking the lead at this juncture?
Yeah, so in terms of the number of instances where Anjeso is used, it's about 50-50. I think we are seeing hospitals come back, but many of them are not back to their normal volumes because there are still COVID cases occupying more of their beds, and especially more of their ICU beds where maybe they're more complex patients could have wound up after surgery. So they're scheduling things with more spacing than we would usually see. But the ASCs also got pretty good at doing more complex orthopedic procedures during the pandemic because they were more accessible and could deal with some of the spacing issues a little bit better. And that was going along pretty well. Omicron somewhat hit the staffs hard at those institutions. So in some cases, they had to close for a week or 2 weeks, but then were able to reopen because it's so transmissible that multiple people on their staff got it, even though they were fully vaccinated and boosted. But as I said, like we're we're finding ways to win, chiseling our way in and finding other opportunities, as well as mixing in some of the medical opportunities. I think the most frequent occasions for relief of serious pain, we treat moderate to severe pain, is associated with surgery, major surgeries. But there are some other conditions, like people who may have needed to have a disc operated on, but they haven't come up the list yet to be able to get the surgery. Pain specialists are now dealing with them with ablative frequency changes that will kind of eradicate the feeling in that nerve for a period of time. And that itself causes some pain, like just having the procedure done. So that's been an area where we've seen a number of those specialists pick up Anjeso and use it. Plastic surgeons who typically are operating outside of the hospital environment, using Ingeso to provide some sustained pain relief. They try to shy away from opioids because many of their patients are going home the same day and want to be able to resume function. So, trying to find some ways to add to and fill in where we're hitting times of pause or times of more difficulty in hospitals. And so we did better last year than the year before, and our hopes are high for this year, even assuming some more COVID will occur before the year's out.
Yeah, unfortunately, my crystal ball is somewhat cracked, so my ability to foresee what the pandemic holds for us in the future is somewhat muted, but I assume we're on the back end of it, and that's always helpful, if indeed we are. On a more positive light, beyond COVID, the CDC recently proposed new opioid treatment guidelines, particularly given the epidemic we talked about earlier, and the side effect issues, the addiction problems related to opioids. Can you discuss what this proposed CDC guideline represents to Bodax Bio, and is it a real positive in your opinion?
So we think it is a positive. We think on three fronts. One, it's raising awareness about the opioid problem. While we hear about it in the evening news, it's the challenge and the kind of the wrestling match in the hospital of using very inexpensive pain therapy, which is very typically opioids, versus using something that's a little bit more expensive, but really very cost effective in terms of the total cost of that patient management. And that is a real plus, we think, for patients. It avoids the risk of their having a vulnerability to opioids. It avoids someone who may have had a prior vulnerability being re-exposed unwantedly to it. And we think that the CDC guidelines focus on almost like a step therapy as a way to try to avoid it, and that can be really helpful. We think that, along with some efforts that are underway in the legislature, could be very helpful. We see CMS beginning to take some positive steps on the way, what they call packaging procedures. So in the outpatient setting, what they will pay you for a given procedure might have had a non-opioid in it. Now at certain price points, they'll let you be passed through over and above that bundling price. And I think that's going to be somewhat helpful too. We're lobbying for that not to be such a high threshold. Interestingly, it doesn't have a cap on what the expense of the non-opioid does, but it says you have to be above a certain threshold to be reimbursed outside of the bundle. And that's $130, which is a pretty high number. So we're doing some lobbying to say, could we reevaluate that? There are less expensive treatments that couldn't be really contributory that could help too. But we're happy that CDC's focusing on this, because I think it kind of got lost in the pandemic and recrudesced.
Excellent. Yeah, I think the spin is very good. I shouldn't say the spin, but it's a positive outlook, I think, for non-opioid treatments, because we need to get we have to get this problem in hand. We have to take care of it. It just can't keep going forever like this. Beyond the near-term commercialization of Anjeso, though, can you discuss a little bit about the long-term opportunities for the neuromuscular blocking agents that you referenced earlier?
Sure. So there are neuromuscular blocking agents on the market that have been around for a long time, and they're effective. There is also a very interesting agent, Sugamidex, also called Bridion, which can reverse those most commonly used agents. It's very expensive, and it works, but it does take a little bit of time depending on whether you're at the beginning of a procedure and you have a lot of the blocking agent on board or at the end. We think an advantage of our basket of products, we have two blockers, one that lasts for about 40 to 45 minutes on a natural basis, another that lasts, we think, in the 10 to 15 minute on a natural basis. And we have a reversal agent that will very promptly reverse each of those agents. And we think that there could be important cost advantages, but time advantages, because the operating room is a scarce resource and time in there is short. And if we finish a case, the surgeon is usually, in a lovely way, bugging the anesthesiologist about, isn't it time to move the patient on so that we can start getting the next patient ready? And there's a lot of pressure on the anesthesiologist if they have a reversal agent that fits the budget and that fits the safety profile and acts quickly, that helps them be able to safely move that patient into the post-surgery unit and maybe let that patient get out of the PACU even faster, keeping the flow of patients moving so that there's ability to catch up on surgeries that have been backlogged and so on. And I think we're seeing, just because of the number of us that are aging, more and more opportunities for surgery outside of the pandemic. So that's a real plus. I think the anesthesiologists that we have spoken with and that have consulted with us to date on the product are excited because it may be a little bit faster in onset. So the faster you can have that onset and have the patient safely intubated, the better. They're breathing then artificially and that all's going well. And the faster that you can get them off of that and breathing normally and on their own is also the better. When you have laparoscopic surgery where they blow up your belly so they can use instruments in there, that puts a lot of pressure on the diaphragm and the venous system. And so you really need to be intubated for those surgeries. And as we do more and more with smaller and smaller incisions, laparoscopic is a really good option for patients. So there will be more surgeries that require these agents. And again, if we can do it well and safely and save time and money for the institutions, I think that's going to be a winning equation.
Yeah, it's a big opportunity, I think. Ultimately, it comes down to, in terms of not only the cost issue, but also the ability to get the patient on and off as quickly as possible. Moving to the stock itself, the Bodax Bio common stock, you recently faced a Nasdaq deficiency, and you also just announced a week or so ago a stock split. Does that cure the deficiency, or are there other things that have to be taken care of as well?
So you have to be out there for 10 days at the price above $1, which is the listing threshold, before you can get a letter from Nasdaq saying you're now in great shape again. So we would be expecting to get that pretty soon because we're coming up on roughly 10 days since then. And we think that puts us in a good position. It was a hard decision to make. We know that reverses are not popular with shareholders, would not have done it had we had other good options. But we think that puts us back into listing. We think the liquidity of being a listed company is important. And now trying to get the sales to continue to move up and looking at ways that we can get more value from the NMBs while being very frugal with our R&D spend.
Yeah, you touched on it, and much like the market recently, the stock itself has been fairly weak. What do you think going forward will help get it moving in the right direction?
So our hope is, we are frankly a little surprised, as we are the best of the hospital launches in the last 2 years, and recognizing that isn't perfect. We're none of us exactly where we would like to be if we were in a normal environment. But as the environment normalizes more, which I think it will, and as we get better at finding a way to win no matter what, we will see improvements in sales quarter over quarter, as we had throughout the year last year. So we're optimistic that those results will finally begin to resonate with investors and say, hey, this dog hunts, there is an opportunity here, this will keep growing. And while we're making progress on the NMBs with studies that are starting on each of the agents in calendar 22, we hope that people will see that's not so far from near term. That could have an impact, in the next 3 years. We are shooting to get one of those combinations filed in roughly 2 years, roughly some point in 24, we think that puts us in a pretty good position in terms of tapping into what can be a very large market. The Bridion product, I believe, last year was about a $1.2 billion product. And while our agent is not the first to be able to behave like that, but a little bit quicker, and in combination with the dedicated units, we think that the market potential for those agents as a basket is quite considerable.
Well, it sounds very promising indeed. The opportunities, I think, are quite large and extensive. Gerri, I appreciate your insights on the company and look forward to the continued progress of Baudax Bio. I want to thank you for taking time for this interview today and wish you the best.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate you taking the time, Greg. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for this C-Suite interview presentation brought to you by ChannelChek. View our YouTube channel for more video content, including C-Suite interviews, virtual roadshows, and conference presentation replays. New content is added regularly, so subscribe below to stay up to date. Visit channelchek.com or click the link in the description to access equity research, news, and advanced market data on this and the 6,000 other small and micro-cap companies listed.